I know what you're thinking. How could something like this happen? How could I fall for the man married to my mom? I wish I could explain it, but it all started with one moment I can't forget, when he saw me in the pool. Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm 21 years old, and this is the story I never thought I'd tell. A story that still feels impossible, even now. It all began during a family vacation. My mom had married Jeff about a year ago, and from the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. Jeff was handsome, charming, and incredibly attentive, too attentive. I told myself he was just being friendly, but deep down, I knew there was something else. I saw it in his eyes. That evening, while my mom was inside chatting with the resort staff, I decided to go for a swim. The pool was quiet, the soft glow of the lights reflecting off the water. I felt free, relaxed, and for a moment, I forgot about the strange tension I'd been feeling around Jeff. But when I glanced toward the patio, I saw him. Jeff was sitting there, his eyes locked on me. It wasn't a casual glance or a fatherly smile. It was something else entirely. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. But then his gaze lingered, trailing down my body as I moved through the water. My heart raced, and I felt an uncomfortable thrill, a mix of excitement and fear. I stayed in the pool longer than I needed to, half hoping he'd leave and half hoping he wouldn't. Every time I glanced at him, he was still there, watching me. Finally, I climbed out of the pool, letting the water drip from my body. I felt his eyes on me, burning into my skin as I grabbed my towel. Enjoying the water, he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in his tone I couldn't ignore. Yeah, I said, avoiding his gaze. It's nice. Good, he replied, standing up. You should enjoy it while you can. These vacations don't last forever. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had sounded. It wasn't fatherly. It wasn't innocent. The next day, I found myself paying more attention to him. I watched the way he carried himself, the way he laughed with my mom, the way his shirt clung to him when he walked out of the water after his own swim. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. Things only got more complicated as the days went on. Jeff seemed to find excuses to be near me, asking me to grab him a drink, sitting next to me at dinner, starting conversations about nothing in particular. One afternoon, while my mom was out shopping, he sat down next to me on the lounge chair by the pool. You're quiet today, he said, leaning back and adjusting his sunglasses. Just tired, I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. He nodded, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my stomach flutter. You should relax. Enjoy yourself. You're young. These are the best years of your life. His words felt innocent enough, but the way he said them wasn't. And as much as I wanted to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't deny the way I felt when he was around. I started seeking him out, finding reasons to be near him. At first, it was subtle, a question about the resort, a comment about the weather. But soon, I was going out of my way to cross paths with him. I told myself it was harmless. But it wasn't. The turning point came one evening when my mom went to bed early, leaving just me and Jeff in the living room. I was scrolling through my phone, pretending not to notice him watching me. Do you want to go for a walk? He asked suddenly. I hesitated, knowing I should say no. But instead, I nodded. Sure. We walked down to the pool, the air warm and heavy with humidity. The silence between us was almost unbearable, but neither of us broke it. When we reached the water's edge, he turned to me. Kelly, he said softly, his voice barely audible. Do you ever feel like there's something between us? My heart stopped. I didn't know what to say. Because I do, he continued, stepping closer. And I don't know how to ignore it anymore. I should have walked away. I should have said something, anything, to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. Jeff. He smiled, a soft, almost sad smile. This is crazy, isn't it? Yeah, I whispered. It is. But neither of us moved. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Jeff had looked at me, the way his voice sounded when he spoke. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and undeniably dangerous. I found myself craving his attention. Every time he walked into a room, my heart raced. I started going out of my way to catch his eye. In the pool, I chose my boldest bikini. Around the resort, I wore dresses that hugged my figure a little too tightly. At first, I told myself it was innocent, just harmless fun. But deep down, I knew what I was doing. Jeff noticed. His glances grew longer, lingering just a little too much when I walked by. His compliments became more frequent, more personal. "Kelly," he said one afternoon as we sat near the pool while my mom was inside. "You always seem so confident. It's impressive for someone your age." "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I mean it," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You have this presence about you. It's rare." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled and looked away, pretending his compliment was no big deal. But inside, I was trembling. I started to seek out moments alone with him. When my mom went shopping or stepped away to take a phone call, I'd find a way to be near him. Sometimes it was just a passing comment, other times it was a conversation that felt like it could stretch forever. Jeff didn't resist. One evening, as we were walking back to the resort lobby after dinner, I trailed slightly behind him, watching the way he moved, the way he carried himself. When we reached the doors, he paused and turned to me. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you're a lot more grown up than I realized." I felt my cheeks flush, but I held his gaze. "Thanks. I guess." "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "I mean it. You're beautiful, Kelly. I don't think you even realize it." His words felt like they should have been innocent, but they weren't. They hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. "Jeff," I started, but I didn't know what to say. He smiled, a soft, almost apologetic smile. "I shouldn't have said that." "It's okay," I replied quickly, too quickly. "Really." But it wasn't okay. Not in the way I wanted it to be. From that moment on, the line between us blurred even more. Every interaction felt charged, every glance and touch deliberate. One day, I found him sitting alone in the lounge area, reading a book. I hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting across from him. "What are you reading?" I asked, my voice light. "Just something to pass the time," he replied, closing the book and looking up at me. "What about you? What's keeping you so busy?" I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. "Not much. Just trying to enjoy the vacation." His eyes stayed on mine, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. "You're doing a good job of that," he said softly. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to pretend there wasn't something between us. He didn't have to say anything, his actions spoke louder than words. The way he brushed his hand against mine when we passed each other, the way he leaned in just a little too close when we talked. I was playing a game I didn't fully understand, and so was he. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. I couldn't help myself anymore. I started pushing the boundaries, testing how far I could take this game we were playing. Every time Jeff looked at me, every time his eyes lingered just a second too long, it set my heart racing. I began to provoke him, intentionally. It was subtle at first, a touch of perfume, a dress that hugged my figure just right, or brushing past him in the hallway. But as the days went on, I grew bolder. We often found ourselves alone. My mom was always busy with something, shopping, phone calls, or lounging by the spa. And during those moments, it was like the rest of the world disappeared. One evening stands out more than the rest. It was late, the resort was quiet, and my mom had gone to bed early after a long day. Jeff and I ended up sitting together on the balcony, the night air warm and heavy with humidity. The stars above us sparkled faintly, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the silence. We talked about everything and nothing, my college plans, his business, memories from our past. At some point during the conversation, our hands brushed. It was such a small, insignificant touch, but it felt electric. I didn't move mine away, and neither did he. The silence stretched between us, charged and unspoken. Finally, he broke it, his voice low and hesitant. "This is wrong," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You know that, don't you?" I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then why haven't you stopped?" He met my gaze, and for a moment I saw the conflict in his eyes, the pull between what he knew was right and what he wanted. "Because," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I can." His admission hung in the air, and I knew we had crossed a line. There was no going back now. "Jeff," I said softly, leaning in just slightly. "Maybe we shouldn't fight it." He shook his head again, but this time, it wasn't convincing. "Kelly, this can't happen." "It's already happening," I replied, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. We stayed there for what felt like hours, neither of us moving, neither of us daring to take the next step. But the tension between us was undeniable, pulling us closer together with every passing second. He finally stood, running a hand through his hair. "I should go to bed," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I nodded, watching as he walked inside, his movements stiff and uncertain. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with everything that had happened. I knew this was a dangerous game, one we couldn't win. But the thrill of it all was intoxicating, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. The next day, I caught him watching me again, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with the same unspoken tension. Neither of us said anything, but we didn't have to. We both knew where this was heading. I didn't know how much further this would go, or how much it would cost me. But one thing was certain, I wasn't about to stop. And neither was he. It happened on a quiet evening. My mom had left the room, saying she was meeting an old friend at the resort bar. For the first time, it was just Jeff and me. No distractions, no interruptions, just us. I knew this was my chance. The tension between us had been building for days, and tonight, there was no one to keep us apart. I walked over to the balcony, where he was sitting, his gaze fixed on the ocean. "Do you want to join me in the pool?" I asked, my voice casual but deliberate. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Kelly." "It's just a swim," I said, flashing a small smile. "What could go wrong?" I didn't wait for his answer. Instead, I disappeared into the bedroom and changed into my boldest bikini, a black two-piece that left very little to the imagination. When I returned, Jeff was still sitting on the balcony, but his eyes widened slightly when he saw me. I could feel his hesitation, but I also saw the way his gaze lingered. "Well?" I asked, tilting my head toward the door. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't a good idea." "But you're coming anyway," I replied confidently, walking past him and heading for the pool. A few minutes later, he joined me. The pool was empty, the water glowing softly under the lights. We swam in silence at first, the only sound the faint ripple of water as we moved. I stayed close to him, letting the tension build with every glance, every unspoken word. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Finally, I broke the silence. "You're awfully quiet tonight," I said, floating closer to him. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" I asked, my tone playful but my heart racing. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt like he could see right through me. "About how complicated this is," he said finally, his voice low. I swam closer, until I was just a few feet away from him. "It doesn't have to be complicated," I said softly. "Kelly," he started, his tone firm but faltering. "We can't." I stepped out of the pool, letting the water drip from my body as I grabbed my towel. I didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me, following every movement. When I turned to face him, his expression was conflicted, torn between what he knew was right and what he wanted. Jeff, I said quietly, holding his gaze. Stop pretending you don't feel it too. He climbed out of the pool, standing just a few feet away from me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us heavy with tension. We can't do this, he said again, but his voice was soft, almost pleading. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Then why are you still here? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from my face. His touch was hesitant, like he was giving me one last chance to walk away. But I didn't. In that moment, everything we'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. All the stolen glances, the unspoken words, the forbidden feelings, it all became too much to contain. We shouldn't, he whispered, his voice trembling. But we will, I replied, and that was all it took. That night, we crossed a line we could never uncross. When it was over, I lay awake in the silence, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not yet. That night, everything we had been holding back came crashing down. The tension that had built up over the past few days was unbearable, and neither of us could fight it any longer. We were alone in the dimly lit hotel room, the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore drifting in through the open balcony door. Jeff stood by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. I approached him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Jeff, I said softly, my voice trembling. He didn't turn around. This is wrong, Kelly, he murmured, his tone heavy with guilt and hesitation. We can't. But we already have, I interrupted, stepping closer. You feel it too. Don't deny it. He turned to face me then, his expression a mix of anguish and longing. This is dangerous, he said, shaking his head. I don't care, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you? For a moment, he didn't say anything. Instead, his eyes searched mine, as though he was looking for a reason to stop. But he didn't find one. When he reached out, his hand brushed against my cheek, his touch hesitant, almost trembling. I leaned into it, my breath catching as his fingers traced my jawline. Kelly, he whispered, his voice raw. I didn't let him finish. I stepped closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Don't think, I said softly. Just don't. His resolve broke. He pulled me to him, his arms wrapping around me tightly as his lips met mine. The kiss was urgent, filled with all the emotions we had been suppressing for so long. My hands tangled in his hair, and I could feel his heartbeat racing as fast as mine. It felt electric, overwhelming, and utterly forbidden. We stumbled back toward the bed, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. His hands found their way to my waist, and I felt a shiver run through me as his touch grew bolder. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low and strained. Yes, I replied without hesitation, my voice firm. I've never been more sure. In that moment, all the doubts, all the guilt, melted away. There was only us, and the feelings we could no longer ignore. That night, we crossed a line we could never uncross. The next morning, the weight of what we had done came crashing down on me. I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, the memory of the night before playing over and over in my mind. I glanced over at Jeff, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out at the ocean. He looked calm, almost detached, but I could see the tension in his posture. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and distant. This has to stay between us, Kelly. No one can ever know. I sat up, pulling the sheets around me. What does that even mean? We can't just pretend this didn't happen. We have to, he said, turning to look at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. There was guilt there, and something else I couldn't quite place. If anyone finds out, it'll ruin everything. I nodded slowly, but the weight of his words didn't make me feel any better. Deep down, I knew he was right. This was our secret now, and it was a secret that would change everything. As Jeff got up and began to get dressed, I felt a lump form in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of what had happened, but I couldn't find the words. When he finally left the room, I sat there in silence, staring at the empty space where he had been. The memory of his touch, his kiss, was still fresh, but it was overshadowed by the crushing realization of what we had done. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The weight of the secret was unbearable, eating away at me every day. I don't know what I was expecting when it finally came out, but I wasn't ready for what followed. It happened during a tense dinner. My mom was asking questions about Jeff's recent behavior, why he seemed distracted, distant. The tension in the air was suffocating, and before I could stop myself, I blurted it out. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something you need to know." Jeff's eyes widened in panic. "Kelly, don't." But it was too late. When the words left my mouth, the room fell silent. My mom's face twisted in confusion, then shock, then anger. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It just happened." Jeff immediately jumped in, his tone defensive. "She's lying," he said, his voice rising. "She's making this up." I turned to him, my anger boiling over. "Stop pretending, Jeff. You know it's true." My mom stared at both of us, her face pale. And then, like a dam breaking, the emotions poured out. She screamed, she cried, she threw her wine glass across the room, shattering it against the wall. "How could you?" she yelled, her voice breaking. "How could either of you do this to me?" I tried to explain, to tell her how it happened, but she wouldn't listen. "I don't want to hear it," she screamed. "You disgust me, Kelly. I can't even look at you." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. Jeff, desperate to save himself, turned the blame on me. "This was all her," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "She came on to me. She's been trying to seduce me for weeks." "That's not true," I shouted, my voice cracking. "You wanted this just as much as I did." But my mom didn't care. She wasn't interested in the details. All she saw was betrayal, by her husband and her daughter. "I don't want you in this house anymore," she said finally, her voice low and full of venom. "Pack your things and leave." I begged her to reconsider, but she wouldn't even look at me. Jeff tried to calm her down, but she pushed him away. "Don't touch me," she spat. "You're just as disgusting as she is." That night, I packed my bags and left. As I walked out the door, I heard her sobbing in the next room, and it broke something inside me. I had destroyed everything. But it didn't end there. Jeff, trying to salvage his reputation, started spreading his version of the story. He told my mom, my family, and anyone who would listen that I was the one at fault. "She's young and manipulative," he said. I didn't know how to handle it. I tried to push her away, but she wouldn't stop. His lies spread like wildfire. My friends stopped answering my calls. My relatives whispered about me behind my back. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of their judgment. "She seduced her stepfather," they said. "She ruined her family. How could she do something like that?" I became an outcast. The once bright and promising future I had imagined for myself was gone. Every door seemed to slam shut in my face. One day, I confronted Jeff. I found him at a cafe, sitting alone with his phone. "How could you do this to me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. He looked up, his expression calm and detached. "I didn't do anything to you," he said coolly. "You did this to yourself." "You know that's not true," I shot back. "You're the one who—" "Enough, Kelly," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "You think anyone's going to believe your version of the story? You're just a kid. I'm the adult. People trust me." His words stung, but I refused to let him see how much they hurt. "You're a coward," I said, my voice steady. "You ruined my life to save your own." He didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his coffee, took a sip, and turned back to his phone. I left that cafe feeling more alone than ever. My life, my family, my reputation, everything had been destroyed. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder if this was only the beginning of the fallout. I thought leaving town would fix everything. A new city, a new beginning. I imagined a life where no one knew who I was or what I had done. But even in a place full of strangers, the weight of my past followed me. Everywhere I went, I felt exposed, as if the world could see right through me. Every smile from a stranger felt fake. Every laugh in the distance sounded like it was at my expense. But they didn't know. They couldn't. The truth was, the judgment wasn't coming from them, it was coming from me. A year has passed since that night, and now I see it clearly. What happened wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of mistake that changes you forever. It shattered everything I knew, my family, my relationships, and my sense of who I was. It wasn't worth it. Not for a second. If I could go back and change it all, I would. But life doesn't work like that. We can't undo the choices we've made. All we can do is learn from them. This is my story, and it's not one I'm proud of. I'm not sharing it for sympathy or forgiveness. I'm sharing it because maybe, just maybe, it will make someone think twice before making the same kind of mistake I did. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever made a choice that changed everything? Something you wish you could take back? Tell me in the comments. I want to know.